I think I may die in this Airbnb. I don't know where my friends are. I don't even know where I am. None of us would have been able to afford this on our own. Even with 5 of us, it was still pricey, but to be fair, it was one hell of a house. It was 3 stories with a dark scallop siding. Paul had grown up in the area and had found the place. He had heard all sorts of things about the place being haunted, some of the dark history growing up, but it hadn't been open to the public back then. When we chose this town at our friendcation destination, he jumped at the chance to stay here. I was intrigued, but the prospect of staying somewhere haunted excited me a lot less than it did with my friends. From the moment we walked in, Ada and I seemed to both pick up on vibes that unnerved us. As Katie, Diane, and Paul went room to room looking around excitedly, we both hung back and hovered closer to the front door. The house was beautiful, yes, but in a foreboding sort of way. The dark wood and stained glass windows meant that very little light truly filtered in, even in the peak daylight hours. The old floorboards protested our friends' steps as they explored the house. A door off to the side of the kitchen caught my attention, and I found myself drawn to it. Inside was a staircase. It was narrow and incredibly steep. You could only see a few steps before it rose out of our sight completely. It looked old, and to be honest, terrifying. "Ada, want to join the tour?" Paul shouted down to us. Paul guided us around like an expert and shared trivia about the house. Even though he claimed he had never been here before, he talked about the place like it was an old friend. He was the newest one of our friend group, so I had only known him a few months. But this was the most excited I had ever seen him. He was almost giddy. The house was large enough for each of us to have our own room. I wasn't excited about that. The last thing my overactive imagination and I needed were a giant room to myself. Just as my eyes began to close that night, I thought I had heard something move along the floor above me. It sounded like something large and wet and was being dragged along the floor. No, not being passively dragged, it was crawling. I could hear a faint, mournful sighing sound through the grate on the wall. I turned on my phone and listened to some music to drown it out. It sounded like it was moaning now. I turned the music up louder, covered my head up with the blanket. I burrowed my headphones into my ears deep enough to cause future hearing loss. If you can't hear it, it can't hurt you, right? Somehow I did manage to fall asleep. I asked the others if they had odd experiences or if it was just me. Paul looked excited. He had lots of questions. He truly was hoping the house was haunted. I just told him I heard footsteps. I felt that had made me sound less crazy than if I had heard something crawling, crying out in the night. He looked at me with a sly smile, almost as if he knew I was lying. We spent the day in town and had an amazing time. Katie asked around about the house we were staying in. An older man at a little ice cream shop we visited told us he had thought it was irresponsible and dangerous to rent the place after what had happened there. It turned out a number of tragedies occurred there, from as recent as the owners before our Airbnb host, and then dating back nearly 200 years earlier. He mentioned how he believed that enough suffering could result in opening a door and letting something in. "So you do think it's haunted?" Diane asked, her green eyes wide. She had been hanging on to the man's every word. "Well, I always thought haunted implied that a human passed on but never left." He scratched his chin and leaned in for effect. "But I don't think what walks those halls was ever human." His words hovered over me the rest of the day like a dark cloud. The sounds from upstairs continued on the second night. The wet slaps, followed by slow drags and cries above me, sickened me. I mentally nicknamed whatever was making those sounds the crawler, and immediately regretted it because giving it a name did not quell my fears. Damn my overactive imagination. I turned the music on again. I woke up around midnight and the album had ended, but luckily so had the disturbing sounds from upstairs. I heard voices coming from the living room area and I figured I'd see if my friends were also being kept up too. There wasn't anyone there. It wasn't like I had just missed them. In this house, the creaky floors would have indicated their movement. I tried to quietly slide back to my room, my socks sliding across the smooth wooden floors. Not long after I closed the door, someone gently rapped their knuckles on my door. It was as if they had been steps behind me the whole time, but why hadn't I heard them then? "Can I come in? Katie whispered. I was so relieved. The house was really getting to me, and I was grateful for the company. Before I could even answer, she repeated herself in a more sing-songy voice. Can I come in? I want to show you something. She called out my name, but struggled to pronounce it like she had never said it before. I froze. Sure, my name may not be all that common here, but we'd known each other for over a decade. She always pronounced it with ease. At my lack of response, it sounded like she was pawing at the door. She let out a sound reminiscent of a wounded animal. I turned all the lights on in my room, and I spent the rest of my sleepless night trying to figure out how to tell my friends I wasn't going to spend another night here. I would still pay my portion, of course, but I was going to be staying in town tomorrow night. I smiled to myself at the thought. Yep, staying in town tomorrow, in a hotel. I'd even have to use some of my savings, but it'd be worth it. The next morning, Paul stared at me, transfixed. Hey! He leaned towards me. What was up with you last night? You came to my door. You kept trying to get me to come to the basement with you, remember? I had never gone to Paul's room. I was too busy with my own ordeal. Ada and Diane had similar stories when they came down. One of us came to their rooms and said something along the lines of, Have you seen the basement yet? Let me show you, and tried to lead them down there. None of us opened the door. Diana, because she was tired and not in the mood to socialize. Paul, because he didn't know me that well and thought I was acting strange. Ada, like me, had the feeling that the visitor at her door was not one of us. Paul and Diana were excited by this. Seems confirmation that our Airbnb was haunted. Ada stared at me, her face grim. As for Katie, well, she never came to breakfast at all. We had plans, and when by noon Katie still hadn't come downstairs, I volunteered to check on her. I ascended the stairs, taking in the unique features of the house. Instead of opening space in the atrium on the third floor, there was a beautiful stained glass window placed horizontally. On the roof parallel was a skylight where the sun filtered through. It cast red and purple swatches of light on the floor below. I had never seen anything like it before. I'm sure this won't come as a surprise to you, but Katie wasn't in her room. I heard footsteps above me on the third floor. I was much braver in the light of day, so I ascended the second flight of stairs and went room to room on the third floor. No one was there, but it was cold, much colder than the second or first floors. I went back to the second floor, trying to fight the urge to glance over my shoulder. I paused in front of the door of the room above mine, where I had heard the crawling and mournful wail the past 2 nights. I considered for a moment and decided to open it. It was locked. Part of me was relieved. While I was upstairs, our friends had checked around the grounds. The only place they hadn't checked was the basement and whatever was up in the stairs in the kitchen. We had regrouped in the kitchen and stared at the dark, steep stairs. Paul said he'd check the basement if one of us could please take the kitchen stairs. The tight space made him nervous, he said. It seemed like a fair trade. After a moment of awkward silence, Diane volunteered, to my immense relief. She was also the smallest of us, as a petite 5'1". Even then, she still had to crawl on her hands and knees to ascend the stairs. We waited, heard her walk around above us, calling out for Katie. She was up there a while. It sounded like the space was massive. My stomach dropped as I realized I heard 2 pairs of footsteps, one above my head and the other further into the kitchen but moving towards the person above me. Diane! I hissed from up the stairs frantically. No answer. I took a deep breath and prepared to ascend after her. Just as I had crawled up about 3 steps, someone moved to stand at the top, blocking the already limited light. We're coming, Diane whispered. She had began to crawl towards me, descending the steep stairs, facing me, but on her hands and knees. Her arms looked long, too long, in order to allow her to do so. She propelled herself towards me using those long, thin limbs. Her eyes glinted at me in the dim light. I yelped and took a backwards leap, nearly hitting my head on the doorframe. I instinctively stood behind the tallest person in the kitchen, Ada, who had a couple of inches on me. Diane emerged. She was walking like a normal bipedal person. I must have imagined what I saw in the darkness. Well, Paul asked, was Katie up there? Diane cracked her neck on each side, stared and smiled at each of us like she was taking in each of our faces for the first time. She shook her head slowly. She gave me a smile unlike the one she flashed at Paul and Ada. She winked at me. She smelled of old things. She looked disheveled and walked stiffly. We looked around. The thing is, there was no door to the basement that we could find. Ada sent what we hoped was a nonchalant message that we all crafted together to the host, asking them where the basement was. We received the unsettling reply immediately. There is no basement. Paul laughed at that. Diane smiled dreamily and stared up at the stained glass skylight. It was like she was in her own world ever since her stint up at the small stairs. Ada and I looked at each other nervously. We went into town to see if anyone had seen Katie and spent the rest of the day searching for her. We sat together in silence. The large living room felt emptier with Katie missing. We stared at a pizza that none of us felt like eating. Looked like I was spending the night here again after all. I locked my door that night. Around what we had become the usual time, I heard the wet, dragging, crawling sounds upstairs. I tried not to picture what the thing making the sound must look like. At home, I always slept with a weighted blanket on me. It made me feel safe. With just a thin sheet and old quilt, I couldn't help but feel exposed here. Around 3 a.m., I awoke to moaning and scraping outside my door. I need your help. I tried to place the voice. It was low, but sounded female. It wasn't Ada. It wasn't Katie. It didn't sound like Diane. It's me, Diane. I didn't reply. The cadence was also odd. The doorknob turned quickly and aggressively. I tried to remain silent, motionless. I need your help. My skin, it's too tight. It doesn't fit. I sat up against the headboard with my hands over my mouth, focused on breathing as quietly as possible as I pounded the door. Eventually, the steps faded away. The next morning, Ada looked happy. She was practically beaming. I realized she looked different. Ada always wore her meticulously applied cat eye eyeliner and her purple lipstick, but this morning, she had no makeup on. Her blue-black hair looked odd. Her bangs that were completely carefully styled and ended up in a delicate point between her brows were hastily brushed off to one side. I had always admired how she presented herself, and had wished I had the skill and patience. She didn't look bad this morning, but she didn't look like herself either. Diane and Paul hadn't come down. I'm going to look for the others, I whispered. You should look up there, Ada whispered in the same husky foreign voice that I heard last night outside my door. She pointed to the kitchen stairs. I felt my throat tighten. No. I shook my head quickly. She responded with a smile. I half expected her to leap at me or follow me on my search for Paul and Diane. She didn't. Instead, she crawled back up those narrow, thin, nightmare stairs, showing the same oddly proportioned dexterity that Diane had demonstrated the day before. I knocked on Paul's door nervously. It was also locked. I continued to knock until he came to the door, groggy. He seemed mildly annoyed at the intrusion. He blocked the view into his room with his body. When I told him I couldn't find Diane, he told me he'd meet me downstairs. Diane was nowhere to be found. Ada had yet to come back from the room above the kitchen. I could hear tearing and wet chewing sounds coming from up the stairs. I locked the door wordlessly. I tried to fight back the bile rising in my throat. I tried to tell Paul we needed to leave, while it was still daylight. I didn't want to leave our friends either, but we needed to come back with more people because something terrible was going on. We were outmatched. We were probably outnumbered. Paul tried to convince me to stay. Surely there was an explanation. We couldn't take the car and leave our friends here. He looked at me accusingly. I loved our friends too, but I wasn't going to spend another night in this place. I thought of the crawler upstairs, behind its locked door, dragging its heavy body across the floor like wet meat, crying out in the darkness for who knows what. I thought of Diane's odd behavior and subsequent disappearance. I thought of Katie, who had a crush on Paul. If she had heard his voice outside the door, I'm sure she would have followed him. I thought of the thing that was likely wearing Ada's skin, eating something messily upstairs. I vaguely wondered if Paul and I were the only ones left. I told Paul I was leaving. As I was packing up, I felt a sharp blow and everything went dark. I woke up in the basement. Turns out there was a basement after all. Katie was down there too. She seemed to be pinned to the wall by her wrists. Her eyes were glassy. She stared ahead, unblinking, pale. "Katie," I hissed at her. She weakly turned her head to me. She was wearing the same clothes she had 2 days ago. Mascara streaks down her cheeks. I was just relieved she was alive. I heard footsteps on the stairs. It was Paul. He was carrying an ice chest and a satchel of tools. I had never been happier to see him. He came to me, squatting by me, and patted me on the head like I was a child, beaming. "You're awake. Great. We still got more mouths to feed." He rubbed his hands together excitedly. There was kind of a madness in his eyes. Despite all the terrifying things I'd experienced in the house, realizing that Paul was part of whatever was happening was 10 times worse. The small remaining hope I had flickered out in that moment. While he fiddled with the tools, selecting something long and sharp-looking, I shifted and positioned my legs underneath me. As Paul approached me, I sprung up and ran towards him, hitting him hard with my shoulder. It seemed to take him by surprise, and I took advantage of his momentary confusion to pick up the ice chest with the only thing I could find with my hands bound. By one handle and swung it at him. It connected with a dull thud, and he fell backwards. I turned towards Katie. Now I could see her legs. It was as if something had been gnawing at them. I could see bone peeking through her torn jeans. I knew I'd have to come back for her later. There was no way I could move her in her current state. I ran up the stairs and my heart sunk when I found I was in the part of the house that I had never seen before. It looked older, lacked the meticulous care applied to restoring and cleaning the rest of the place. I wondered which of the many doors led out, but the fact that one door was nailed shut served to both further dash my hopes and answer the question. I limped. My leg was asleep. Through the dusty hallway, I found a room where light seeped through 2 small windows and locked the door. I've called the police. All I can do now is wait and hope I can either get one of the sealed windows open or the police find me before Paul and one of the other residents do.